Hi guys, I'm a bit late getting this video done, so I'll jump right into it with an excerpt from Chapter 1 of my new novel, The Greenhouse Binary, the book I wrote this past week for Author vs. AI. Jada's breath was not quite strong enough to last. The candles nearest her were extinguished, but the flames from the far side of the cake wavered and held firm. "It's okay," her mom encouraged. "Give it another go." The third time was the charm to put the eighth candle out. Hollow applause echoed in her ears. Her friends eager to eat cake. Then there was a bustle to cut and serve slices to 10 girls and boys who were ready to down their weight in sugar if given half the chance. "Forget it," she heard one of the parents say at the back of the room, where the men congregated with sweaty cans or bottles in their hands. It was her best friend Chloe's dad, and he was talking to her own father. "Sammy, you know where I stand on this." No one would be so crass to raise their voices at her birthday party, but Jada was more observant than most. When the parents were ushered into the next room to eat their dessert in peace from the child chaos, she got up and followed, her ice cream melting into a soggy, forgotten mess on the plate behind her. If there was something interesting going on in the grown-up world, she was not going to miss it. "We have to agree to disagree," her dad was saying as he got another beer from the fridge. He opened it with a crack hiss. "Problems? Yes, I'll give you that. But we've always had flooding and mudslides. It's because the population is booming and they're building houses where they have no business building. Look at the San Francisco quakes." He shook his head. "What we need is an infrastructure package that will help rebuild the roads and improve drainage." 10 inches in 2 hours, Chloe's dad interrupted. "In Los Angeles. That's not just an unheard of record for rainfall. That's catastrophic." "So it was," her father agreed, "but it was a freak occurrence. That's happening every year now. Well, not 10 inches, but every rainy season we have more floods, more droughts. When will enough be enough to convince you government guys?" "Unfair, Marcus." He held up his beer can for emphasis. "I'm not even part of the decision-making process. I just sit at a desk all day and push papers through." "Well, maybe push the right papers." "Dear." Marcus's wife put a hand on his arm and he stopped mid-sentence. "Perhaps not the time." Her eyes traveled to the doorway and Jada jumped back guiltily. She had been caught. But Marcus's wife wasn't a tattletale apparently, because she said nothing to anyone else in the room. Jada peeked around the corner again. Marcus ran a hand through his hair and shook his head. "You're right. Sorry." He turned back to Jada's father. "I apologize, Sammy. We can talk about this later." Sammy chuckled. "I hope not. You're a real attack dog when you get a hold of something." The two men shared an uneasy laugh, and it was this moment that Jada remembered later, after her friends had returned home and when she was in bed that night. The tense exchange between grown-ups talking about something she half understood, something so important that they were practically at each other's throats. And at the funeral 2 months afterward, when she felt both numb and torn apart by grief, she remembered that moment again. The catastrophe that her father had dismissed and which ended up sweeping away her family. When the storm alerts came on a few days ago, she was at school. The teachers whispered together, loud enough for students to know something was wrong, but too quiet to find out what. She got stuck at school because it wasn't safe for the buses to drive, but her older brother was sick that day and stayed home. Cheap tract houses built for desert climates, not tropical storms. Later, Jada saw the news reports that spoke of millions of dollars of property damage in the region and over 100 people dead. It almost made it worse. They weren't the only ones with a roof and ceiling that collapsed and trapped her family under debris that might not have killed them by itself, but combined with the flooding was a death trap. As she waited for a child services worker to show up at the police station, she overheard, "Cause of expiration, asphyxiation due to drowning." Her Aunt Verity, her mother's sister, arrived a couple of hours later. She gave Jada a long hug and her eyes were watery as she stared down at her new responsibility. "The streets were almost impassable," she said quietly as an apology for her tardiness. Jada felt too tired to say much, but after her aunt spent some time speaking with the police, Jada was able to go home to her aunt's slightly cluttered house in Lawndale, which was south of downtown LA and the next town over from where she grew up. All the towns smushed together into one large urban sprawl, though. Part of the reason why, when the floodwaters roared through, so many people had died. The funeral was shortly afterward. "We therefore commit this body to the ground, earth to earth," she heard with just her ears and no other part of her. Her heart was already composed of the ash they spoke of, the dust that blew across the desert landscapes she knew too well, filled with tumbleweed emotions too fleeting to be encouraged. In sure and certain hope of the resurrection of eternal life. She never understood the promise of eternal life. Dying to live. What sense did that make? It was like starving yourself to feel full, or breaking a leg in order to feel healthy. She knew she was supposed to appreciate the sentiments being expressed by the priest, but he had a cold gaze, and she just couldn't. His eyes were sharp, and she had a feeling he didn't miss much. Neither did she. There was one moment where she couldn't seem to look away from him. Their eyes met, clashed. She could see he felt no pity for her, that his condolences were just a show. He hadn't known her parents or her brother. He was arranged to be here by her aunt, who was handling all the details. She wished that they didn't have to do this so publicly, that her family could just be buried with only her aunt and her there, no one else. But they had to have the side-by-side caskets, flowers, blown-up pictures of their faces that were painful to look at, and the people here she didn't know dressed in somber colors. Both before and after the service, adults came up to her and told her how sorry they were and how her parents and brother were such good people. But how did they even know? These people hadn't been on the inside of their family, hadn't known about when their mother was too tired to cook after a long day at work, and she would tell them to make their own dinner while she took a rest on the couch for a few minutes. They would make cheese sandwiches in the toaster oven, giggling to try to stay quiet, and they would put in too much cheese and it would drip down to the bottom of the pan and sizzle and turn black and set off the fire alarm. And then their mother would get up and stomp around and tell them in her tight, angry voice to be more careful or they'd burn the house down. And couldn't she just get a few minutes to herself? They wouldn't answer, looking down at the ground to try to avoid making her more mad, but knowing they'd failed. Or when her dad sometimes coached her brother Jack too long when the lights would come on and he was hungry for dinner and her brother would yell that their dad was pushing him too hard and storm off, throwing his bat and mitt to the ground and slamming the door to his room. And then he wouldn't come out and their dad would pound on the door and tell him to stop being such a baby, that he had to grow up or he'd never succeed in life. Well, that wasn't a problem anymore, Jada knew. There would be no success for Jack, no failure. Just nothing. Nothing at all. As you can see, Jada's had a rough start to her introduction to the severe and personal consequences of climate change. But her journey will go on, and she and the family she builds will end up making a difference for good. This upcoming week's book will be a unique exercise in shifting and changing story formats. Stay tuned a little later today to find out what I mean.